They thought I'd stay quiet because I lived outside their gate. They thought dumping their winter snow onto my land over and over was just part of the job. No permission, no apology. Just 50 tons of dirty ice crushing my property and collapsing the shed I built with my own hands. But what they didn't know is that I don't forget trespass. I don't erase boundaries. And I sure as hell don't let bullies hide behind bylaws. So I took every pound of their snow and I built something they couldn't ignore. A wall. 7 feet tall, legal, frozen, unmovable. And when they screamed from behind it begging for mercy, I just watched it melt. Because justice, like snow, always finds its level. I've called this place home for 11 years now. It isn't some sprawling mansion, but it's mine, 2 acres of sloping brush and gravel just beyond the manicured gates of the Sterling Pines Estates subdivision. Close enough to catch the occasional ripple of their rules and regulations, yet far enough removed that I once believed I'd escape their reach entirely. My land is truly my own. There are no covenants binding me, no monthly dues, slipping into someone else's coffers, no nitpicking letters about paint shades or lawn height. I chose this spot deliberately. After 2 decades in the military, constant orders, relentless structure life dictated by someone else's timetable, I craved a corner of the world where no one could tell me how to live on what was legally mine. I built the tool shed with my own hands, welded the battered mailbox into a steel post, sunk deep in concrete, and carved out a long dirt driveway that announces every arrival with a satisfying crunch beneath tires, especially in winter. I never joined the HOA. That was by design. When I signed the papers, I double-checked every survey line, every boundary marker. Freedom, plain and simple. But on the morning after the season's first true blizzard, I stepped onto my porch with a steaming thermos of coffee and nearly let it slip from my grip. My entire back fence line, half my property, really was swallowed beneath a towering mass of frozen debris at least 8 feet high in places. This wasn't the light sparkling powder that had fallen gently through the night. No, this was dense compacted ice-gray slush streaked with road salt embedded with grit and tire grease, the unmistakable refuse of plowed streets. It had been hauled here, deliberately. At first, I wondered if wind or gravity had simply shifted the drift from the slope above. But the evidence told a different story. Heavy grooved tracks, wide treads from a skid steer or dump truck cut straight across my land, entering from the side boundary without hesitation or permission. I followed them slowly, boots sinking into the crust until the trail vanished beneath the mound. The tracks crossed the eastern boundary post, brightly tagged in yellow for visibility, as if the marker were invisible to whoever drove through. No note, no apology, no warning sign. Just a mountain of someone else's winter waste, now claiming residence on my soil. I stood there in the biting cold wind, whipping crystalline flecks against my collar, trying to process the violation. It wasn't until I heard the distant beep, beep, beep of a plow's backup alarm across the road that understanding settled in my gut like lead. The HOA. Sterling Pines Estates lay directly opposite my driveway. Tidy rows of near-identical homes, uniform mailboxes, winding lanes kept pristine by a board that governed with military precision, or so they liked to think. I'd endured minor skirmishes before passive-aggressive flyers about noise when I fired up the chainsaw at dawn, veiled reminders about property lines. Nothing that ever crossed into open conflict. But this was no minor infraction. This was trespassing, property damage, unauthorized dumping on private land. I trudged back up the driveway, boots crunching through the hardened surface, and headed straight for the shed. I pulled out a folding ruler A-level and a metal survey stake I kept for remarking old fence lines. Minutes later, I was back at the northeast corner pin, measuring precisely until I reached the edge of the glacial heap. 10 feet inside my line, unmistakable. They hadn't merely allowed overflow. They had driven their plows across the county road past my clearly posted boundary and offloaded their community's burden directly onto my acreage. I went inside, kicked off my boots, and opened my laptop. The email was calm, factual, professional. To Karen.Delaney@Sterling Pines HOA. Org subject unauthorized, displacement of frozen refuse onto private property. I attached photographs taken moments earlier, GPS screenshots, pinpointing the exact coordinates, and closed with a simple request. immediate removal, and assurance that this would not happen again. I didn't expect warmth. I didn't expect speed. But 2 hours later, Karen Delaney's reply landed in my inbox. Mr. Bishop, thank you for your concern. Due to limited public disposal options and ongoing emergency clearance operations, some redistribution of wintry accumulation may extend beyond HOA boundaries. We appreciate your understanding during this severe weather event. Best regards, Karen Delaney, President Sterling Pines, HOA. Redistribution. That was the word she chose, as though relocating tons of contaminated ice onto private land were a minor inevitable side effect of winter itself, rather than a calculated act of trespass. I read it 3 times. Then I stared out the window at the steaming mound salt crystals glinting faintly in the weak sunlight. The coffee in my mug had gone cold, but the anger settling in my chest burned steady and slow. This wasn't about frozen slush. It was about ownership, boundaries, respect. And I knew one thing, with absolute certainty: if I let this slide, they would bury me under their problems again and again, literally and otherwise. I created a new folder on my desktop. I named it simply Sterling Pines Winter Violations. The first photographs went in. The GPS logs, Karen's email. I wasn't sure yet where this would lead, but I was certain of one thing: I would not be buried in silence. The morning after Karen's dismissive reply, I drove into town under a sky still heavy with the threat of more winter. I needed supplies, not for revenge, not yet, but for clarity. I bought a dozen bright red fiberglass stakes, the kind topped with reflective bands that catch headlights like warning beacons in the dark. I added a thick spool of yellow caution tape, the heavy-duty industrial roll used on construction sites, impossible to ignore, impossible to claim as an accident. Back home, I started at the tree line and worked my way along the entire eastern boundary, every painstaking foot from the woods down to the county road. I hammered those stakes into the frozen ground with a mallet, the impacts ringing out sharp and final in the cold air. Between each post, I stretched the yellow tape taut, tying it tight so it snapped and fluttered in the wind like a row of angry flags. From a distance, it looked almost like a crime scene perimeter, and in a way it was. What they had done crossed far beyond neighborly oversight into outright violation. I stepped back to survey the line. The invisible had been made vivid, undeniable. It declared without words, "This is mine. Stay out." Around noon, a familiar blue Ford F-150, bearing the Sterling Pines HOA emblem, cruised slowly past my driveway. Behind the wheel sat Cole Mason, one of the board members, the one who always carried a clipboard and a perpetual scowl, forever measuring lawns or counting violations. He rolled his window down just enough to give me a long, disapproving stare as he passed. No greeting, no acknowledgement. Just that silent judgment before he accelerated away. That evening, another email from Karen waited in my inbox. Mr. Bishop, we have reviewed your concerns and noted the placement of your boundary markers. However, as your property lies outside the jurisdiction of the Sterling Pines HOA, it is not subject to our standard winter clearance protocols. Please understand that we are responsible for the safety and accessibility of an entire community, and we cannot guarantee that adjacent wintry accumulation or emergency operations will not occasionally impact neighboring lots. Best regards, Karen Delaney. A polite shrug wrapped in bureaucratic language. She framed it as though I were the unreasonable party, as if accepting tons of contaminated ice on my land were simply the price of living next to their perfect little enclave. I was still rereading her words, feeling the quiet burn of indignation rise, when a low mechanical rumble vibrated through the floorboards. I glanced out the window and saw it, a yellow cat skid steer, lumbering down the HOA's side lane, dragging a wake of scraped ice behind it. Then, without hesitation, it crossed the road, dipped into my ditch, and dumped another full bucket of gray salt-laced slush directly onto my property, mere feet beyond the fluttering yellow tape and freshly planted red stakes. They weren't ignoring me. They were challenging me. I pulled on my coat and gloves and marched down the slope. By the time I reached the boundary, the machine was already reversing engine growling as it retreated towards Sterling Pines. The operator never slowed, never looked my way. Just executed the dump and vanished as if my presence, my markers, my land itself were irrelevant. I stood there, in the fading light breath fogging in the frigid air, and let the moment sink in. This was no accident. This was deliberate defiance. I took more photographs, close-ups, of the fresh tire grooves slicing across my line, wide shots, showing the new mound engulfing one of the red stakes like a slow-moving avalanche. I recorded a short video, my voice steady on the audio track, narrating timestamps, coordinates, and the blatant disregard on display. Evidence didn't require shouting. It only required precision. That night, I sent a second email. No pleasantries this time. Attached a PDF compiling the latest time-stamped images, GPS data, and highlighted excerpts from the county code governing property rights and waste displacement. I closed with a single unambiguous line. Any further unauthorized displacement will be fully documented and reported to municipal authorities. Her response arrived the next morning quicker than I expected, almost as though she'd been waiting. Mr. Bishop, we have reviewed the materials you provided. While we do not share your interpretation of events, the board has voted to suspend any further displacement activity adjacent to your property for the remainder of the winter season. Please note, however, that Sterling Pines HOA accepts no liability for indirect accumulation resulting from municipal operations or natural weather patterns. Sincerely, Karen Delaney, a small concession wrapped in layers of denial. They were retreating just far enough to avoid immediate scrutiny. I recognized the tactic yield a little ground sound, reasonable, wait for the storm, literal or figurative, to pass. Then test the boundary again. I wasn't fooled. That same day, I climbed a sturdy oak at the upper edge of the slope and mounted a trail camera, high-resolution motion activated with infrared night vision. I aimed it squarely at the usual dumping zone. I created a detailed spreadsheet columns for date, time, vehicle description, and weather conditions estimated volume. Every interaction, every storm, every glimpse of HOA equipment would be logged. I even reached out quietly to an old contact from my consulting days, with the city someone in zoning enforcement, who still owed me a favor. I didn't ask for action, only clarification on procedure. I wanted to understand exactly how strong a case I could build if the ceasefire proved temporary. Part of me hoped it wouldn't come to that. Part of me hoped the markers, the emails, the cold weight of documentation had finally driven the point home. That hope lasted exactly 4 days. Then the next major storm rolled in, and with it, the illusion shattered once more. The next storm arrived on a Thursday night, fierce and unrelenting. Heavy wet flakes slammed against the windows like thrown gravel piling up fast under a wind that howled through the pines. I stayed awake late watching the security light carve pale tunnels through the swirling white, listening to branches groan under the growing weight. By dawn, the world outside was transformed, blanketed, muffled, locked in ice. And so was my land, again, deeper this time, wider. The red stakes I had hammered in with such deliberate care were completely buried, swallowed beneath 5 additional feet of compacted, salt-streaked refuse. The yellow caution tape hung in ragged shreds, some sections frozen stiff into the crystalline mass, others flapping limply like surrender flags after a lost battle. The tire tracks were fresh, unmistakable wide grooves, cutting straight through where my boundary markers had stood proud only days before. This wasn't oversight. This wasn't even defiance anymore. This was erasure. A slow, cold rage settled in my chest, not the explosive kind that shouts and slams doors, but the quiet, immovable sort that hardens over time like ice thickening on a lake. I stood at the edge of the violation, that Friday morning breath fogging in the frigid air, and stared at the latest glacial heap dominating my slope. They had plowed right over my warnings, literally and figuratively. I decided then that words alone would no longer suffice. I needed a response they couldn't ignore, one built from irrefutable proof. I retreated to the shed and retrieved my old GoPro, its battery still holding charge from occasional trail use. I mounted it high on a sturdy metal pole at the upper tree line, angled precisely toward the habitual dumping zone. I connected it to a weatherproof power bank and set it to motion-triggered recording day or night. The next day, I added a second layer of surveillance, another infrared trail camera positioned lower for overlapping coverage. No blind spots, no excuses. Then I turned to the digital battlefield. I created dated subfolders, meticulously organized. Every video clip was renamed with timestamp and description. Every photograph received embedded GPS metadata. Using satellite imagery, I overlaid transparent property lines, mine in bold red, theirs in blue, and traced arrows showing the exact paths of their equipment entry points, turning radii dump locations. I built a visual chronicle that left nothing to interpretation. It took hours to reconstruct just the most recent incursions, but by the end I possessed something undeniable, a step-by-step timeline, proving that Sterling Pines HOA was engaged in repeated systematic trespass and illegal displacement of contaminated winter waste onto private land. By Sunday, I had cataloged 6 distinct violations in under 2 weeks. Using rough density estimates approximately 20 pounds per cubic foot, I calculated they had offloaded more than 50 tons of road-gridded, chemically laced ice onto my acreage. 50 tons that would leach salt into my soil-crush vegetation come spring and potentially damage the shallow drainage running toward the trees I had planted years ago. I cross-referenced local ordinances until the relevant sections were committed to memory. County Code Section 4.12 on winter operations and waste disposal was crystal clear. No private entity, contractor, or association shall relocate accumulated ice onto adjacent private property without explicit written consent from the landowner. I had never given consent, not once, and now I had high-definition footage to prove it. Still, I held off on formal reporting. There was one question gnawing at me, one piece I needed to understand before escalating further. Why? Why go to the effort of crossing the road, navigating my ditch, climbing the gentle rise, just to unload here? Sterling Pines had designated retention areas deeper inside their own boundaries. They could have contracted proper municipal sites. So why risk the liability on a quiet non-HOA neighbor? The answer came unexpectedly, over coffee and small talk at the local hardware store. I was restocking memory cards and heavy-duty zip ties when I bumped into Ben Holtz, a snow removal contractor I'd known casually for years through American Legion events. After the usual pleasantries, I steered the conversation toward the subdivision across from my place. Sterling Pines, Ben's face tightened. Yeah, I bid on their contract last fall. Didn't get it, went to some cut-rate outfit out of county. Word is Karen Delaney pushed through a cost-saving initiative this season. They're handling everything in-house, no city disposal fees. In-house meaning? He glanced around, lowered his voice. Meaning they're supposed to stockpile internally, but everyone knows those retention basins fill fast. Rumor is they quietly arranged access to neighboring undeveloped parcels for overflow. No permits, no contracts, just convenient, empty space. Undeveloped parcels, empty space. That was their phrase for my 2 acres. To them, land without an HOA badge was fair game, unoccupied, uncomplaining, invisible. They had weighed the odds, a solitary veteran living outside their gates, minding his own business. He'll grumble, maybe send an email, but he won't fight. They miscalculated. Because I wasn't just solitary. I was methodical. I had time, patience, and a spine forged in harder winters than this. That night, I compiled everything into a comprehensive 8-page dossier. Full-color photographs, video frame, captures, satellite overlays, direct ordinance, quotes, and a concise narrative of events. I printed it on heavy stock, slid it into a clear weatherproof sleeve, and walked it across the road to the HOA clubhouse drop box addressed personally to Karen Delaney. No cover letter, no threats. Just the unvarnished truth laid out like evidence on a courtroom table. 3 days passed in silence. Then, on a crisp Wednesday morning, a marked sheriff's SUV eased into my gravel driveway. 2 deputies emerged, Deputy Jenkins, a solid no-nonsense veteran I recognized from previous minor calls in the area, and a younger trainee at his side. They were courteous, but official. "Morning," Mr. Bishop Jenkins began. "We received a report concerning potential obstruction of emergency routes and interference with snow removal operations. Mind if we take a look around?" I invited them in without hesitation. Over coffee at my kitchen table, I walked them through the entire timeline, dates, images, videos, code violations. They watched the footage in silence, brows furrowing deeper with each clip of HOA equipment crossing my line. When I finished, Jenkins closed his notebook slowly. "Between you and me," he said, "this doesn't look like a criminal matter on your end. If anything, you've built a textbook civil case, repeated trespass, After written warnings, strong one. I've warned them multiple times, I confirmed. Email certified letter hand-delivered report. They left with digital copies of everything and a promise to log it properly. I watched their SUV pull away, only to stop briefly at the clubhouse where Karen waited in her signature red blazer, gesturing animatedly. Jenkins listened, nodded once, then drove off without further engagement. I didn't know what she'd hoped to achieve by calling them on me. Intimidation, perhaps, a show of authority. But all she accomplished was adding another official record to my growing file. Because this wasn't over. They weren't just displacing winter waste. They were displacing responsibility. And sooner or later, I intended to return all of it right back to their doorstep. The pristine white envelope arrived without fanfare, slid quietly into my mailbox by some unseen hand. Embossed lettering gleamed across the top: Sterling Pines Homeowners Association. Official board correspondence. No stamp, no postmark, just the subtle scent of entitlement that seemed to cling to everything they produced. I let it sit on the kitchen counter for a while, brewing fresh coffee and watching frost etch delicate patterns across the window pane. I'd learned long ago not to rush into battles. Sometimes the wisest move is to let the enemy reveal their hand first. When I finally slid it open, the words inside were exactly what I expected: polished, veiled, and sharp. Subject: cease and desist. Interference with community operations. Mr. Bishop. It has come to the board's attention that your recent activities, including the erection of physical markers, ongoing video surveillance of association equipment and personnel, and repeated documentation efforts, have generated unnecessary tension and may pose a safety risk to residents and contractors. You are hereby directed to immediately cease all recording, unauthorized monitoring, and any actions that could be construed as interference with essential seasonal maintenance or emergency access routes. Non-compliance may prompt appropriate legal measures. Sincerely, the Board of Directors, Sterling Pines HOA. Classic HOA maneuvering, vague enough to sound ominous, specific enough to intimidate. Unauthorized surveillance on my own trees, facing my own land. Interference with operations that were already illegal. They were flipping the script, painting me as the aggressor for daring to defend what was mine. It didn't frighten me. It clarified everything. I added the letter to my expanding archive and opened my laptop once more. That evening, I dove deep into their world. I downloaded the full Sterling Pines HOA bylaws, hundreds of pages of covenants, restrictions, and appendices. Buried in Section 7 was the clause requiring annual submission of snow removal contracts to the city, complete with verified disposal sites that did not encroach on municipal roads or private property. Failure to comply, potential fines, revoked permits, board liability. I expanded my search to the county code archives and found Chapter 12.14, unlawful use of private land for waste disposal. Repeated trespass for the purpose of offloading refuse, including seasonal ice, was explicitly cited as grounds for civil action and mandatory municipal inspection. I picked up the phone and called Dana, an old colleague from a zoning reform project years back. She'd moved into code enforcement consulting and still had contacts downtown. Without spilling every detail, I described the pattern: repeated incursions, warnings, ignored, documented equipment crossings. What you're outlining, she said carefully, sounds like a textbook land use violation. With timestamps, mapping, and footage, you could file tomorrow and have a strong shot at enforcement. I'm not there yet, I replied, but I'm building the foundation. Smart, she said. Layer it thick. They'll lawyer up fast. I thanked her and hung up, already sketching the framework for a formal complaint. That same night, another plow rumbled through the darkness, but this time it paused at the edge of the county road, engine idling like it was second-guessing itself. The blade pushed a wide bank along the curb, hovering uncertainly for finally reversing and retreating into the subdivision. No new mound appeared on my slope. They were wavering. It was progress, but I knew better than to celebrate. People who wield petty power rarely surrender it gracefully. The following morning, I mailed a certified letter, old school, trackable, undeniable, to the HOA clubhouse. Enclosed, a bullet point summary of the 6 documented violations. A high-resolution map with boundary lines and incursion paths highlighted. Printed excerpts from the relevant statutes. And a concise final notice. Effective immediately. Any additional unauthorized displacement onto my property will trigger direct reporting to the City of Rosegate Land Use Enforcement Division. I will also pursue full recovery of damages stemming from property degradation, structural impacts, and unlawful environmental contamination. Consider this official notification. I kept the signing receipt, the tracking number, every scrap. Over the weekend, a crew arrived, not city trucks, but a private landscaping company wearing Sterling Pines vests. They spent hours with shovels and snowblowers chipping away at the edges of the massive heaps on my land. They didn't clear everything, far from it, but they removed enough to expose patches of frozen grass and reveal a few of my buried red stakes. It wasn't restoration. It was damage control. A quiet concession. I watched from the porch, thermos in hand, offering no words, no gestures. Karen didn't appear. Cole didn't drive by. But the message had landed. Still, a restlessness lingered. This wasn't merely about my acreage anymore. It was about the mindset, the casual assumption that anyone outside their gated bubble was disposable, that rules applied only when convenient. And then came the storm none of them anticipated. The one that didn't bury my land. It buried theirs. The nor'easter slammed in without mercy, a rare inland beast packing wet, concrete-heavy accumulation, followed by a flash freeze that turned every surface into armored glass. 30 inches in a single night, branches snapping like gunfire power lines sagging under the crushing load. I've weathered worse in my life deployments, where winter wasn't an inconvenience, but a lethal adversary. I respect storms the way you respect a predator. You don't provoke it, but you prepare. That morning, I layered up and stepped into a hushed, white-locked world. My breath hung thick in the air as I crunched along the back path toward the tree line. When I rounded the corner and saw the shed, or rather the place where it had stood, something tight gripped my chest. The roof had imploded under the compounded weight weeks of their illegal heaps, topped by nature's final blow. The metal frame buckled inward like crushed foil walls, caved hinges ripped from their mounts, plywood splintered and half entombed. Tools scattered. My late wife's old gardening gear, trowels she'd loved, pots she'd painted, buried beneath the wreckage. It wasn't just storage lost. It was history, memory, a structure that had endured every season since I'd built it. Crushed not by the storm alone, but by the pattern, the relentless, sanctioned disregard that had piled burden upon burden until something finally broke. The quiet rage I'd carried for weeks crystallized into resolve. This wasn't property damage anymore. This was the breaking point. I turned back to the house boots, carving deep tracks, and sat at my desk. No more measured emails. No more certified warnings. I opened a new document and began drafting a formal incident report to the city, complete with every date, every frame, every calculated ton, and now the collapsed shed with repair estimates attached. I included a direct request for immediate municipal inspection of Sterling Pines' winter disposal practices. I didn't send it, not yet. First, I had one final task. I needed them to feel the weight they'd forced on me. I needed to hand it back load by careful load. I fired up my compact track loader, the one I'd bought used for driveway work, and listened to its engine growl awake. Then I began scooping their refuse, their salt-laced, contaminated debris, and moving it with deliberate precision. Not across their line, but right up to it, where it would matter most. I began with the frozen debris closest to my eastern boundary, the same contaminated heaps they had repeatedly offloaded over the past month. Bucket by bucket, I scooped the dense, salt-crusted refuse, the gritty slush that carried the scent of diesel and de-icer. My loader's engine growled low and steady as I maneuvered carefully, never once crossing into their pavement. I stayed firmly on my side of the line, every movement deliberate, every load calculated. Their only true exit, Pinecone Circle, curved gently downhill from the heart of Sterling Pines, funneling all 30-odd households toward the main county road. At the point where their asphalt met my gravel shoulder, the space narrowed just enough to be vulnerable. Just wide enough for what I had in mind. A barricade. I dumped the first loads along that shoulder, then used the blade to pack them tight, compressing the mass into a solid core. Second passes layered more height and depth. By late afternoon, I had sculpted a formidable wall, nearly 7 feet tall, 10 feet thick at the base, a compacted glacier of their own making. For good measure, I sprayed water across the surface from my garden hose, letting the plunging temperatures seal it with a hard, glassy crust that gleamed under the weak winter sun. I double-checked everything with my handheld GPS unit. The entire structure sat inches inside my surveyed line, not one flake encroached on their road. Legally untouchable. Practically devastating. By dusk, the barricade stood complete, a frozen monument bisecting their escape route. From the road, it looked as though a chunk of Arctic ridge had calved off and planted itself exactly where it would cause maximum inconvenience. I shut down the loader, stepped back, and allowed myself the faintest sense of equilibrium. For the first time in weeks, the weight pressing down on me had shifted. That night, I slept deeply, the kind of rest that comes when action finally aligns with conviction. Morning brought the payoff. It started with distant shouts muffled through the trees, then escalated into a symphony of slamming doors, spinning tires, and revving engines. By the time I carried my coffee onto the porch, the performance was in full swing. A cluster of residents had gathered at the base of the wall, bundled in expensive parkas and clutching travel mugs, staring up at the icy barrier as though it had materialized from another dimension. A white SUV sporting an HOA decal was already mired in a slush, pocket tires whining uselessly. At the forefront stood Karen Delaney, red blazer vivid against the white gloves, stripped off arms, waving like signal flags. "He's blocked the entire road," she shrieked, voice carrying clear across the divide. "This is criminal. We have children trapped in here." A man I vaguely recognized from past zoning hearings shook his head. "It's not on the road, Karen. Look, it stops right at the white line. That's his property. It's obstructing access," she snapped. Another voice, quieter but sharp enough to cut through, kind of like the way our plows obstructed his shed. The crowd rippled. A few heads turned toward the collapsed structure, visible in the distance, behind my house. Karen's mouth opened, then closed without a retort. Someone else, a woman cradling a toddler on her hip, murmured, "Is that our snow?" Karen offered no answer. I remained on the porch, silent steam rising from my mug. I didn't wave. I didn't smile. I simply observed as confusion and frustration, once aimed solely at me, began to fracture and redirect. The wall held for 3 full days. 3 days of bottled-up deliveries, canceled appointments, residents forced to park on the main road, and trudge hundreds of yards through drifts. 3 days of frantic HOA app threads and whispered complaints. An anonymous neighbor, bless them, forwarded me screenshots of the group chat. "Why is there suddenly a giant ice dam at the exit? Did the city authorize this? Can we sue the guy? He's not even in the HOA. I heard the board was dumping on his land first. Someone should just talk to him. He's a vet, right? Talk to me now after weeks of trespass and threats, after burying my shed and dismissing my warnings." No. They had chosen snow as their weapon. I had merely returned it re-engineered and repositioned. Each day I added fresh layers from the remaining drifts on my acreage, packing tighter, sculpting the face until it resembled a deliberate dam. I mounted bright orange safety flags along the crest, purely for visibility, of course. I even laminated a sign and staked it front and center. Private property. Do not cross. Structure composed entirely of unauthorized, displaced refuse. Trespassers will be documented and reported. Clear, legal, poetic. On the second afternoon, Cole Mason's black Range Rover lingered at the wall's edge for nearly 15 minutes. He never stepped out, just sat behind tinted glass clipboard, undoubtedly in hand, staring at the frozen testament to his board's miscalculation. On the third morning, the city finally arrived. 2 public works employees in neon vests walked the length of the barricade, snapping photos, consulting tablets. One approached my porch name tag reading, "Tyson." "Mr. Bishop." That's me. He glanced back at the wall, lips twitching with reluctant admiration. "Gotta say, that's one hell of a snow sculpture." I handed him a prepared folder. Survey maps, boundary certification, chronological documentation, video stills. Every ounce in that wall came from their equipment onto my land first. I simply relocated it. He paged through, expression shifting from amusement to respect. "We got a complaint about emergency access obstruction." "It's not on their pavement," I said, gesturing. "That shoulder is mine. They still have full lane width." Tyson nodded. "Checks out. We'll note it." As he turned to leave, he paused. "Word of advice, they'll escalate. They always do." I met his eyes. "I'm ready." And they did escalate. That same afternoon, Karen's latest email arrived, tone shifted from command to thinly veiled pleading. "Mr. Bishop, in the interest of neighborly cooperation, We respectfully request removal of the current ice structure impeding community access. While past events may have involved misunderstandings, it is vital we move toward amicable resolution. Sterling Pines stands ready to discuss equitable future winter management arrangements. We await your convenience for a meeting. Karen Delaney. Cooperation. Now that their residents were inconvenienced, now that control had slipped suddenly, I was a neighbor worthy of dialogue. I didn't reply. Instead, I walked out and reinforced the wall with another dense layer, each bucket a silent reminder boundaries are not suggestions. That evening, a small knot of residents gathered again, anger tempered now by curiosity. One man in a knit beanie waved cautiously. "Hey, Mike from Pinion Lane? Look, most of us didn't know about the dumping. That wasn't right." I nodded once. He raised both hands in surrender. "Just wanted to say this thing you built honestly. Kind of legendary." I allowed the corner of my mouth to lift. "Thanks. Think it'll melt come spring." "Eventually," I said. And I meant it. Let them live with the consequences a while longer. Let them explain to delivery drivers and visiting relatives why their exclusive enclave was sealed by a monument of their own hubris. For the first time since the first illegal load, I wasn't the one buried. I was the one holding the line. The morning light on the fourth day broke sharp and unforgiving, turning the wall into a blinding sheet of crystalline armor. Overnight cold had polished its surface to a mirror finish, throwing back reflections of bare branches and pale sky. It no longer resembled a mere pile of relocated refuse. It stood like a deliberate fortification, a silent sentinel marking the exact edge of what was mine. To them it was sabotage. To me it was justice frozen patient and unyielding. That was the morning Karen finally shattered. I was in the garage, sorting through the splintered remains of the shed, separating salvageable tools from twisted metal, when the shouting erupted. Not the distant grumbling of frustrated residents, but a raw, piercing tirade that cut through the still air like a blade. I stepped outside rag in hand and saw her planted at the base of the wall, boots sunk in the shoulder drift, face flushed crimson against the white expanse. "This is illegal!" she screamed, voice cracking with fury and something closer to desperation. "You can't seal off an entire community. You're deranged!" Steam billowed from her mouth in furious clouds. Her signature red blazer looked almost violent against the monochrome landscape hair escaping its tight bun in wild strands. I stayed on the porch unmoving. She stalked closer, halting just shy of the boundary, as if an invisible force field held her back. "This is endangerment." "What about ambulances? Fire trucks? Lives are at stake here." "Then they'll use the secondary access," I replied, voice level. "There is no secondary access," she shrieked. "You know that." I tilted my head slightly. "Design flaw, then. Something the HOA board should have addressed during planning." Her eyes bulged. "You think this is a joke? You're toying with people's safety?" "No," I said. "You started toying with mine the moment you turned my land into your landfill." 30 tons, Karen. 30 tons that crushed my shed. That was accidental runoff. I have video of your contractors crossing my line 6 separate times. Deliberate, documented. She flung her arms wide, nearly slipping on the ice. "We're suing you. This ends today." "Excellent," I answered. "Discovery will be fascinating. I'll bring the footage, the GPS logs, the collapsed structure photos. You bring whatever you've got." The words landed like a hammer. I watched the realization flicker across her face, not remorse, but the dawning terror of someone who had finally overplayed a winning hand. She wasn't facing an irritated recluse anymore. She was facing a man with evidence stacked higher than the wall itself. Behind her, residents had begun to gather again, phones subtly raised, pretending to check messages while recording the meltdown. An elderly woman shook her head and walked away, muttering. A younger couple exchanged glances that carried no sympathy for their president. Karen spun, scanning the growing audience, and saw the shift. The room, her carefully curated community, was no longer hers to command. She retreated in stumbling steps, refusing offered arms, storming back toward the clubhouse, with her coat flapping like a defeated banner. I remained on the porch, long after she vanished, the cold seeping through my jacket, but unable to touch the calm that had settled over me. Not triumph, not yet. Just the quiet knowledge that the tide had turned. That afternoon, an unmarked city sedan crunched down the county road and parked near the wall. 2 officials emerged, badges, glinting snowshoes laced tight. The man introduced himself as Marcus Lyons, Land Use Inspector. His assistant Celia carried a tablet and measuring tape. "We've had complaints from Sterling Pines," Marcus said, eyeing the barricade with professional curiosity. "Claims of obstructed critical access and safety hazards." I handed over my ever-ready folder. I expected as much. Full documentation inside surveys timelines, video captures. The structure is built exclusively from material illegally displaced onto my property. It occupies only my surveyed shoulder, no encroachment on their pavement. Marcus flipped through the pages, expression growing more serious with each turn. Celia walked the base, confirming the boundary with her own device. "He's correct," she reported back. "The wall sits entirely on his side." Marcus closed the folder. "We'll need to confer with both parties, but preliminarily, you've stayed within your rights. Impressively so." "I've had time to prepare," I said. He gave a small nod of understanding. "Expect official correspondence soon." They departed without drama, leaving the wall untouched. That night, I stood at its crest with a lantern surveying the darkened subdivision beyond. Streetlights cast weak pools on stalled vehicles and empty cul-de-sacs. No plows moved, no new heaps appeared on my slope. Silence reigned, not the fragile hush before another violation, but the heavier quiet that follows a decisive stand. Yet I knew better than to declare victory. People like Karen do not yield gracefully. When cornered, they lash out with process, with lawyers with every tool their position affords. And true to form, the knock came 2 days later, just before noon. 3 measured raps on my door, the kind that carry authority. I opened it to find Deputy Jenkins again, flanked by his younger partner. They looked colder than last time, scanning the wall in the background with renewed interest. "Mr. Bishop," Jenkins began, "we're responding to a welfare check request from the HOA along with renewed concerns about route obstruction. Mind if we step inside for a few questions?" Welfare check. Karen's latest gambit reframed me as unstable, perhaps even dangerous. If she couldn't win on facts, she'd try fear. I swung the door wide. "Come in. Coffee's fresh." At the kitchen table, with my comprehensive folder already waiting, I laid everything out once more, calmly, chronologically. The deputies watched the footage, reviewed the maps, read the ordinances. When Jenkins spoke again, his tone carried no accusation. "You've been thorough." Had to be. And the wall's purpose: relocation of unauthorized material back to the boundary. No further. The younger deputy suppressed a grin. Jenkins shot him a look, then closed his notepad. "We'll classify this as a civil matter," he said. "No criminal violation on your part. Clear documentation." As they rose to leave, Jenkins paused. "Off the record, I've fielded more calls from that HOA this winter than the last 5 years combined. This wall's the first one that actually made sense." I allowed a faint smile. "Tell Karen I offer snow sculpting services, veteran discount." He chuckled all the way to the cruiser. Later that day, a plain sheet of paper appeared in my mailbox. No envelope, just folded once. "Mr. Bishop." Many of us only learned the full story recently. "We thought you were just being difficult. We didn't know about the repeated dumping the shed. None of it. That wasn't fair. It wasn't right. I'm sorry." A neighbor. Unsigned, but genuine. I hadn't sought allies. I hadn't needed applause. But the crack in their united front was widening. By week's end, the wall had earned its own folklore. Local Facebook groups buzzed with photos. Someone dubbed it the Great Sterling Pines Ice Barrier and pinned it on Google Maps. Teenagers posed for selfies. A Snow Karen effigy appeared one morning, red scarf flailing arm's tiny clipboard. I left it all untouched. I added one final reinforcement layer, packing it denser higher. Not out of anger anymore. Out of principle. I had taken their weapon, their careless, contaminated burden, and forged it into something unbreakable. Evidence, patience, resolve. And now the law, the neighbors, even the weather itself stood on my side. Karen was running out of moves, and I was just getting started. The cracks in Sterling Pines' facade spread faster than meltwater in spring. First came the official letter from the city, delivered in a crisp envelope bearing the municipal seal. It announced a formal inquiry under Code 12-14-5, improper waste displacement by private association. The notice cited preliminary review of submitted evidence and multiple citizen reports, and stated that Rosegate would investigate the HOA's winter operations in full. I had never filed a public complaint, but I had quietly forwarded copies of my dossier timestamped videos, GPS overlays, ordnance violations to the channels Dana had suggested. No fanfare. Just steady, methodical submissions. Truth delivered one irrefutable piece at a time. Karen had not been ready for the spotlight. The next sign of fracture arrived via email, not from her, but from her attorney. Mr. Bishop, I have been retained by the Sterling Pines Homeowners Association. My client acknowledges your allegations and the pending municipal review. In the interest of de-escalation and community harmony, we propose a confidential meeting to explore mutually acceptable resolution options. Please advise of your availability. Angela Brine, Esquire. No denial, no counter-threats. Just the polite language of someone who knows the ground is shifting beneath them. I did not respond. Private deals and quiet handshakes were not what this had ever been about. This was about accountability, public recorded, permanent. 2 days later, public works crews arrived with laser scanners, soil probes, and clipboards. They ignored my property entirely and focused on the subdivision's internal zones, the community green space retention basin, bone dry and snow-free. The back slope behind the clubhouse, the narrow green strips that were never meant for heavy storage. Within hours, the violations piled up like fresh drifts. Failure to designate proper disposal sites. Proximity of contaminated refuse to protected watershed areas. Absence of filed annual winter management plan. Documented trespass onto adjacent private land. The city slapped a preliminary $12,000. Fine on the HOA, modest by their standards, but the symbolism was devastating. For the first time in their polished history, Sterling Pines was officially cited, on the record, exposed. That Friday night, Karen called an emergency membership meeting in the clubhouse. Normally, these gatherings were sedate affairs, scented candles, perfectly arranged chairs, a coffee urn bubbling politely. This time, cars overflowed the lot and lined the streets. Residents queued out the door, bundled against the cold faces, tight with questions. I stayed home. But Ben Holtz, my snowplow contractor friend, kept me updated in real time. His cousin lived on Pinion Lane and was inside. Karen's up there spinning it as a regrettable oversight due to extreme weather, Ben texted. Crowd isn't having it. Someone just asked why the retention basin was empty, while his shed got crushed. She went pale. Then a guy demanded to see the dumping contracts. She couldn't produce them. It's getting ugly, man. The final message came after midnight. They just took a vote. Suspended her as president pending full review. Interim board to take over next week. I set the phone down and walked out to the porch. The wall still stood glistening under the moonlight edges, softened slightly by daytime thaw, but core solid as ever. A monument not just to their refuse, but to their unraveling. The following afternoon, Cole Mason appeared at my boundary line for the first time since the chaos began. He stood just on their side hat, literally in hand, waiting until I stepped outside. Afternoon, Bishop. Cole. He cleared his throat, eyes flicking toward the barricade. The board, what's left of it, sent me. Nobody saw this snowballing the way it did. I waited. We didn't know the full extent, he continued. The shed collapsing the volume. We were following Karen's lead. Thought it was just minor overflow. You didn't want to know, I said quietly. He flinched, but didn't deny it. Point taken. Silence stretched between us, broken only by distant wind in the pines. We're drafting new policies, he said. City-approved sites only. Full contractor vetting. No more off-site anything. We're also auditing every contract she signed. Turns out a lot of it wasn't properly documented. Sounds like a start. He glanced up, meeting my eyes for the first time. You built that wall to send a message. Message received. Loud and clear. Any chance we help dismantle it, get things back to normal? I considered the question, the man, the moment. Then I shook my head. No, I'll let nature handle it. Relief washed over his face. Fair enough. He turned to go, then paused. You coming to the spring cookout new board's hosting? Trying to reset. I actually laughed, a short, genuine sound that surprised us both. I'll bring the snow cones. He grinned, despite himself. See you around, Bishop. And he walked away. By late March, the thaw began in earnest. Each sunrise chipped away at the edges. Rivulets carved channels down the face, exposing layers of grit and salt like geological strata of poor decisions. The wall shrank, day by day, 7 feet, to 5, then 3, until only a slushy ridge remained studded with my orange flags like forgotten grave markers. But its legacy outlasted the ice. A new sign appeared at the subdivision entrance. Sterling Pines, HOA. Undergoing structural reform in partnership with City of Rosegate Planning. New winter protocols enforced. No off-site displacement permitted. Not an apology, but accountability in black and white. The city closed its investigation with a final letter HOA found at fault mandatory policy. Overhaul boundary respect training for all contractors. I framed it and hung it inside the half-rebuilt shed. Karen vanished from sight. Rumors placed her in Sarasota, staying with family. Some said indefinite leave. Others whispered lawsuits that never materialized. It didn't matter. Her authority had melted faster than the wall. One gray April morning, a familiar car eased into my driveway. Not an HOA vehicle. Her husband. He climbed out in civilian clothes, jean sweater, no clipboard, no blazer in sight. He looked older than I remembered, carrying a small paper bag. "Won't keep you long," he said. "Karen's gone. Moved down to Florida last week. Permanent, far as I know." I nodded. He held out the bag. Inside was a single sheet of heavy linen paper, her handwriting unmistakable. I was wrong. I didn't listen. I believed my position allowed me to redraw lines that weren't mine to move. "You showed me what a real boundary looks like. I'm sorry. Karen." I read it twice. The words were spare, almost fragile. "She wanted you to have that," he said. "And this." He produced an envelope, cash for shed repairs. I didn't take it. "I'll rebuild it myself." He understood. "Thought you might say that." He left as quietly as he'd come. That apology, hollow or heartfelt, didn't change what had happened, but it confirmed what I already knew. The wall had done its work, not just in ice and salt, but in consequence, in reminder, in the simple, unshakable truth that one person armed with patience and proof could force an entire system to confront itself and win. Spring arrived not with a roar, but with a steady drip, relentless, patient, inevitable. By mid-April, the once imposing wall had dwindled to a low, tired ridge of gray slush, pocked with embedded gravel and the faded remnants of my orange flags. Patches of stubborn grass emerged beneath it, bent and yellowed, but unbroken, pushing toward the strengthening sun. I never laid a hand on it to hasten the end. I let the seasons do their work the same way evidence and consequence had done theirs. The earth, it turns out, is remarkably resilient when finally relieved of someone else's burden. The subdivision changed too. People passed my driveway more slowly now. Windows rolled down on warm days. Hands lifted in cautious waves. Some stopped altogether, mail carriers with a quick nod, dog walkers offering small talk about the weather. I received a tin of homemade muffins from the woman on Alder Lane, a six-pack and charcoal from Mike on Pinion Lane. A hand-drawn card from a kid named Spencer slid under my door one afternoon, a crayon rendering of the wall with a stick figure me standing triumphant beside a tiny loader. Scrawled beneath, "Coolest thing ever." I kept the card on my fridge. The new HOA board wasted no time signaling reform. Laura Wilkins, quiet, competent with a background in real estate, took the interim presidency and made it permanent. One of her first acts was a community-wide email outlining the revised winter protocols, city-vetted disposal, only full transparency on contracts, mandatory boundary training for every contractor. No exceptions. A week later, a discreet plaque appeared near the clubhouse entrance alongside the reform sign. In recognition of community feedback and municipal guidance, Sterling Pines commits to responsible, neighbor-inclusive operations. Still no direct apology to me, but the subtext was unmistakable. I began rebuilding the shed in earnest, not in haste, not with prefab shortcuts. I worked weekends and evenings, cutting each beam by hand, pouring deeper concrete footings, framing a steeper roof with reinforced trusses. I used pressure-treated lumber throughout galvanized hardware that wouldn't rust, metal roofing in a dark green that blended with the pines. It rose stronger than before, taller doors, better ventilation, a small overhang porch where I could sit out of the rain. One Saturday, an older gentleman I'd never met shuffled up the driveway with a thermos and offered to hold boards while I drilled. We didn't talk much, just measurements and the occasional grunt, but the help was welcome. By early May, the structure stood complete, solid, and square against the skyline. On the inside wall near the new workbench, I mounted a small bronze plaque I'd had engraved downtown. Private land. Respected boundaries. Winter 2025. It caught the light whenever I opened the door. Mike dropped by one sunny afternoon with that six-pack and a grin. "Whole vibe's different now," he said, cracking open a beer on my new porch step. Board meetings are actually boring again. Laura runs them like a business, not a dictatorship. I took the offered bottle. Good. You should come to the cookout next month. They're inviting everyone inside the gates or not, trying to rebuild trust. I considered it watching dragonflies skim over the recovering grass where tons of refuse had once sat. "I'll think about it." He laughed. Fair enough. A few weeks later, the formal invitation arrived, thick cardstock, tasteful font. Laura's handwritten note on the back. "Mr. Bishop, we know you're not a member of the HOA, and you never will be. But you're part of this broader neighborhood, and we'd be honored if you joined us for the spring gathering. No agendas, just food, music, and a fresh start. Hope to see you there. Laura Wilkins, President Sterling Pines, HOA." I went. Not for forgiveness, I hadn't offered it, and they hadn't asked. I went to see the change with my own eyes. The cookout sprawled across the clubhouse lawn, picnic tables, under string lights, smoke curling from grills. Kids chasing fireflies as dusk settled. Burgers sizzled. Someone had set up cornhole boards and a playlist of classic rock. Residents mingled in small clusters, laughter carrying on the warm air. No one mentioned the wall directly, but it hovered in every glance, my way, respectful nods, quick smiles, the occasional "glad you could make it." Plates were pressed into my hands, unasked. A cold drink appeared whenever mine ran low. Laura found me near the dessert table. "I read every page you submitted to the city," she said quietly. "The detail. It was extraordinary." "Had to be," I replied. She nodded. "If we ever forget again, I hope someone holds us accountable the same way." "Let's hope it doesn't come to that." We left it there. As night deepened, I slipped away early, walking the gravel road back to my land, under a sky thick with stars. The subdivision lights glowed softly behind me, contained, no longer spilling over boundaries drawn long ago. My property felt different too. Not because the grass had greened or the shed stood taller, but because the invisible line around it, once ignored, then contested, now acknowledged, had become something tangible. A psychological border. A social one. They no longer tested it. They no longer assumed. And if anyone ever tried again, I glanced toward the shed, where my loader waited under its new roof, and allowed myself a small private smile. I was ready. Summer settled in fully by June, the kind of warm, languid days that made the winter feel like a distant nightmare. The air carried the scent of fresh-cut grass and pine resin instead of diesel and de-icer. My 2 acres had recovered remarkably. The slope where tons of contaminated ice had once dominated now bloomed with wildflowers and resilient patches of green. The earth, given space to breathe, had reclaimed itself. So had I. The shed stood as my quiet testament, sturdy, purposeful, built to last through whatever came next. I spent evenings there organizing tools on pegboards, wiping down the workbench, occasionally pausing to read the bronze plaque by lantern light. It wasn't vanity. It was reminder. The neighborhood, too, had found a new equilibrium. Residents no longer averted their eyes when passing. Conversations at the mailbox lingered longer, talk of gardening tips, fishing spots, the upcoming county fair. Mike from Pinion Lane became a semi-regular visitor, showing up with cold drinks and stories from the reformed board meetings. "It's like night and day," he'd say. "No more secret votes or surprise assessments. Laura runs it, transparent budgets, posted online, minutes, emailed same night." I listened more than I spoke, but the ease of it felt earned. One humid afternoon in July, a sleek black sedan eased into my driveway, out of state plates, rental clean. A woman stepped out, mid-40s, professional blouse and slacks, sunglasses perched in her hair. She looked familiar, but it took a moment to place her. "Dana," I said, wiping sawdust from my hands as I emerged from the shed. She smiled, extending a hand. "In the flesh." Thought I'd drop by since I was in the area for a city consulting gig. We settled on the porch with iced tea. She glanced around the rebuilt shed, the thriving land, the faint scar where the wall had melted. "You did it," she said simply. "The whole inquiry stemmed from your submissions. They're using your documentation as a training case now how not to manage winter operations." I shrugged. Just wanted my property back. "More than that," she countered. "You exposed a pattern. Other subdivisions are auditing their boards because of this. Quiet ripple effect. We talked shop for a while, code updates, enforcement trends before she stood to leave. If you ever want to consult again, she said, doors are open. I'll stick to woodworking. She laughed and drove off, leaving dust settling in the sunlight. The biggest shift came in August, on a day when thunderstorms threatened but never quite arrived. Laura Wilkins appeared at my door unannounced, holding a folder and looking slightly nervous. "Hope I'm not intruding," she began. I wanted to deliver this personally. Inside the folder, the final city report stamped closed. Full exoneration on my actions. Permanent injunction against any future off-site displacement by Sterling Pines and a mandated annual boundary survey at HOA expense. There's something else, she added, pulling out a second sheet. The board voted unanimously to name a small community fund after the lessons from this winter. It's for property improvement grants open to all neighbors inside or outside the gates. We'd like to call it the Bishop Boundary Respect Initiative. I raised an eyebrow. She hurried on. It's not charity. It's acknowledgement. And the first grant check is made out to you for any lingering repairs or upgrades. The amount covered far more than the shed. I didn't tear it up. I didn't need to prove anything anymore. I'll think on it, I said. She nodded, understanding. Take your time. As fall hinted at the horizon leaves tinging gold, air sharpening at night, I found myself reflecting more than planning revenge. The war was over. Not because they'd surrendered outright, but because the battlefield had changed. Respect wasn't demanded anymore. It was given freely earned through the long, cold months of standing firm. One crisp September evening, I walked the old boundary line at dusk. The red stakes had long since been removed. The yellow tape faded into memory. But the line remained clearer than ever in the minds of those across the road. I paused where the wall had stood tallest now, just smooth grass underfoot. No monument needed marking the spot. The story itself had become the marker. And as the first stars appeared overhead, I turned back toward the glow of my porch light. The land was quiet, the boundaries secure. For the first time in years, I felt not just ownership of my acres, but true peace within them. Winter would come again. But this time I knew exactly where I stood. And so did they. Now in the quiet depth of early summer, with the sun hanging long and golden over the pines, my land feels truly mine again. Not just on paper, but in a way that settles deep in the bones. The scars from that brutal winter have faded. The slope where the glacial heaps once loomed is now a sweep of vibrant green, dotted with black-eyed Susans and Queen Anne's lace that sway in the breeze. The driveway crunches the same as always under my boots, but the sound carries no tension anymore. The shed stands proud, stronger, straighter, its new roof catching the light like a promise kept. I spend evenings on its small overhang porch, coffee cooling beside me, watching fireflies blink across the field. The bronze plaque glints whenever the door swings open. Private land, respected boundaries, winter 2025. It isn't there for show, it's there for memory. For the nights I sat inside, compiling evidence while the wind howled. For the morning I stared at the collapsed ruin and decided enough was enough. Across the road, Sterling Pines hums with a different energy now. Cars slow as they pass my mailbox. Windows roll down. Hands wave without hesitation. Conversations start easily about the best spot for bass in the nearby creek or how the wild raspberries are coming in thick this year. I've become, almost without trying, part of the fabric again. Not inside their gates, never that. But acknowledged, seen. Mike still drops by with cold drinks and updates. The new board under Laura runs like clockwork. Budgets, public decisions voted openly, contractors held to ironclad rules. No one speaks Karen's name anymore. She remains a ghost in Florida, her red blazer and sharp commands dissolved like the wall itself. The cookout invitation turned into something regular, informal gatherings, where the fence line blurs for an evening. I show up when I feel like it. I leave when I'm ready. No one presses, no one assumes. One warm August night after a barbecue that spilled laughter into the dark, Laura walked me to the edge of the clubhouse lawn. "We still talk about it, you know," she said softly. Not the wall itself, but what it taught us. That rules only work when everyone respects the same lines. I nodded. Lines have to be real to matter. She smiled. You made ours real again. We parted with a quiet handshake, no speeches, no ceremony. Just understanding. These days, when storms roll in, thunder rumbling over the ridges, rain lashing the windows, I don't tense the way I used to. I don't check the tree line for headlights or listen for the growl of heavy equipment. The cameras are still there tucked in the branches, but their memory cards gather dust. Winter will return as it always does. The first flakes will fall, the plows will rumble, the streets will need clearing. But I know now with a certainty that runs deeper than any survey stake. They will stay on their side. They will manage their burdens within their own gates. Because they learned the hard way, the cold way, what happens when they don't. And I learned something too. That ownership isn't just a deed in a drawer. It isn't fences or flags, or even a 7-foot wall of their own frozen refuse. It's the quiet knowledge that you will stand, that you will document, that you will wait, and that when pushed far enough, one person with patience proof and an unbreakable spine can redraw the map for everyone. My land is quiet now. My boundaries are respected. And if anyone ever forgets again, well, I still have the loader. I still have the footage. I still have that plaque shining in the lamplight. And I still have the will to remind them. But I don't think I'll need to. The message was delivered. In ice. In evidence. In consequence. And it will outlast any storm.